The Galactic Military Academy squatted on the third moon of Centris Prime like a metallic cancer, all gleaming towers and intimidating architecture designed to make new recruits wet themselves on sight, which, considering the variety of species that attended, created a fascinating rainbow of bodily fluids across the landing pads each semester. The Academy prided itself on turning soft civilian spawn from across the galaxy into hardened warriors capable of defending the United Worlds Alliance. What it hadn't counted on was Wynne. At exactly 4 feet, 11 inches of pure human stubbornness, wrapped in regulation combat fatigues that hung off her frame like a sad tent, Wynne represented everything the Academy's brutal selection process should have filtered out. She couldn't bench press her own body weight. Her sprinting speed made arthritic grandmothers look like Olympic athletes. During hand-to-hand combat training, she got tossed around like a rag doll in a hurricane. And yet, somehow, she was still here. "Pathetic!" Instructor Vexitar roared, his 6 arms gesticulating wildly as Wynne picked herself up off the training mat for the 5th time in as many minutes. The insectoid's mandibles clicked with disgust. "You call that a fighting stance? My larvae show more combat instinct." Wynne spat blood, her own, unfortunately, and raised her fists again. Around the training circle, her fellow cadets watched with expressions ranging from pity to outright amusement. The Felian contingent was making barely disguised wagering gestures with their tentacles, probably betting on how long it would take for her next opponent to flatten her. Her next opponent happened to be Thak Moore, a mountain of crystalline muscle from the Silicate Collective. He stood nearly 8 feet tall and looked like someone had crossbred a bulldozer with a very angry gemstone. His laugh sounded like gravel being processed in a cement mixer. "This is waste of time," Thak Moore rumbled, his voice carrying the subtle vibration that made smaller species' teeth ache. "I do not fight children." "I'm 22, Wynne said, wiping blood from her split lip. "And I'm not a child." "Could have fooled me, tiny human." This came from Drex, a Saurian whose idea of wit involved pointing out obvious physical differences. He lounged against the wall with his pack of sycophants, all teeth and toxic masculinity. "Maybe you should try the culinary program instead. I hear they need someone small enough to clean the inside of the food processors." A few cadets laughed. Wynne's jaw tightened, but she kept her mouth shut. She'd learned that responding to Drex's provocations only made things worse. Instead, she focused on Thak Moore, who was already moving toward her with the inexorable momentum of a landslide. What happened next was predictable, brutal, and mercifully brief. Thak Moore didn't even bother with fancy techniques. One massive crystalline fist caught Wynne in the solar plexus, lifting her clean off her feet and sending her sailing backward. She hit the mat hard enough to bounce twice before sliding to a stop at the edge of the circle. The medic, a bored-looking Aquarian whose species had evolved excellent bedside manner along with their gills, floated over to check on her. "Broken ribs?" he asked in his melodious, waterlogged voice. "Just bruised," Wynne wheezed, struggling to sit up. "I can keep going." "No," Instructor Vexitar clicked decisively. "You cannot. Report to Medical Bay. Again." As Wynne limped toward the exit, she became aware of an unusual sensation. Someone was watching her. Not the casual observation of her fellow cadets enjoying the show, but focused, intense scrutiny that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She turned. In the far corner of the training hall, partially hidden in the shadows between 2 equipment lockers, stood the most terrifying creature she'd ever seen outside of a nightmare. Malin belonged to the Vexmari, one of the few species in the Alliance that everyone else was secretly afraid of. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, with midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His head was elongated and reptilian, filled with teeth that could punch through starship hull plating. Muscles rippled beneath his natural armor with each breath, and his yellow eyes, each one the size of Wynne's fist, tracked her movement with predatory precision. Those eyes were currently fixed on her with an expression she couldn't interpret. Not hunger, exactly. Not amusement, either. Something else entirely. Something that made her stomach do uncomfortable little flips. Malin was legendary among the cadets. He'd arrived at the academy 6 months ago and immediately established himself as the apex predator of their class. Not through bullying or showboating, but through casual demonstrations of overwhelming physical superiority that left no room for doubt about his position in the pecking order. When Malin sparred, other cadets stopped to watch. When he moved through the corridors, smaller species instinctively gave him a wide berth. When he spoke, which was rare, everyone listened. The fact that he was currently staring at her with unwavering focus was disconcerting. "Move along, human," Instructor Vextar snapped. "Medical bay, now." Wynne tore her gaze away from Malin and hobbled out of the training hall, but she could feel those yellow eyes boring into her back until the doors sealed shut behind her. 3 days later, during a routine survival exercise in the Academy's environmental simulation chamber, Wynne discovered exactly why Malin had been watching her. The exercise was designed to be challenging but not lethal. Emphasis on designed. The simulation chamber could recreate any environment from scorching desert to frozen tundra, complete with weather patterns, hostile wildlife, and terrain hazards that could kill you just as dead as the real thing. Today's special was Jungle Death World, featuring aggressive flora, venomous fauna, and enough environmental hazards to keep the medical staff busy. Wynne found herself partnered with 3 other cadets, a Aquarian named Flux, whose gills kept him perpetually nervous about dehydration, a Felian called Slicks, who compensated for his species' natural cowardice with loud bravado, and a human named, well, it didn't matter what his name was because he spent the entire exercise complaining about everything from the humidity to the quality of their emergency rations. They'd been trudging through the synthetic jungle for about 4 hours when Wynne heard the scream. It came from somewhere ahead and to their left, a sound of pure, primal terror that cut through the ambient noise of the simulated ecosystem like a vibroblade through butter. Wynne recognized the voice immediately. Malin. Without thinking, she broke away from her group and sprinted toward the sound. Behind her, Flux gurgled something about sticking together and following protocol. But Wynne was already gone, crashing through the undergrowth with all the stealth of a wounded elephant. She found Malin in a clearing, and for the first time since she'd known of his existence, the apex predator looked, well, not vulnerable exactly, but definitely in trouble. He was suspended about 15 feet off the ground, wrapped in what appeared to be synthetic vines that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. More vines were emerging from the surrounding trees, reaching for him with obvious predatory intent. A carnivorous plant, of course. The Academy's simulation designers had a sick sense of humor. "Hang on!" Wynne shouted, then immediately felt stupid. Where exactly was he going to go? Malin's massive head turned toward her, those yellow eyes wide with something that might have been surprise. "Small human," he rumbled, his voice strained. "You should not be here. Dangerous." "Yeah, I noticed." Wynne was already scanning the clearing, her mind racing. The plant was obviously programmed to respond to movement and heat signatures. Malin's considerable bulk and body temperature had made him an irresistible target. But Wynn was small, small enough to potentially slip under the plant's sensory threshold. Maybe. She dropped to her belly and began crawling toward the base of the plant's main trunk, moving slowly and deliberately to minimize her thermal signature. The vines above writhed and groped, but none of them reached for her. Either her plan was working, or she was about to become the galaxy's smallest organic fertilizer. The plant's root system was exposed at the base of the trunk, a weak point that the simulation designers had included for cadets clever enough to spot it. Wynn pulled out her standard-issue combat knife and began sawing at the largest root she could reach. "What are you doing?" Malin called down, his voice tight with strain, as more vines wrapped around his torso. "Killing a plant," Wynn grunted, working the blade deeper into the fibrous root. "Try not to fall on me when this thing lets go." It took another 3 minutes of frantic cutting before the root finally severed. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entire plant convulsed, its bioluminescent patterns flickering and dying as its vines released their grip on Malin. The massive Vexmari dropped like a stone, landing in a crouch that somehow managed to be graceful despite his size. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the clearing. Then Malin rose to his full height and took a step toward her. Wynn's survival instincts finally kicked in, reminding her that she was alone in a synthetic jungle with one of the galaxy's most efficient predators. A predator who was now looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. "You saved me," he said, his voice carrying a note of wonder that seemed completely at odds with his fearsome appearance. "It was just a simulation," Wynn said, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under that intense yellow gaze. "You would have figured out how to escape eventually." "Perhaps." Malin tilted his massive head, studying her like she was some fascinating new species he'd never encountered before. "But you did not hesitate, did not calculate odds. You heard distress call and responded immediately." "Anyone would have—" "No," Malin interrupted, taking another step closer. "They would not. Most would have followed protocol, contacted instructors, formed committee, debated proper response. You acted." Wynn backed away, bumping into a tree trunk. "Look, I should get back to my group. They're probably wondering where I am in your debt, small human." The way he said it made Wynn pause. There was something formal about the phrase, something that suggested it carried weight beyond simple gratitude. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. Malin's head tilted further, and those predatory features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile if you were feeling generous with your definitions. "We shall see," he said. The next day, Wynn learned what "we shall see" meant in Vexmari. She was walking to the mess hall for lunch when she encountered Drex and 2 of his saurian cronies blocking the corridor. This was never a good sign. Drex had a talent for turning mundane encounters into unpleasant experiences, and he seemed particularly creative when Wynn was involved. "Well, well," Drex drawled, his reptilian features twisted into an ugly grin. "If it isn't the Academy's smallest failure. Tell me, tiny human, how many times did you get thrown around the training mat this morning?" "Only 3 times," Wynn said, trying to edge past the group. "I'm improving." Drex's companions laughed, harsh, barking sounds that echoed off the corridor walls. "Improving," one of them said. "From terrible to slightly less terrible is still terrible." "Maybe we should help her improve," Drex suggested, cracking his knuckles, with sounds like breaking branches. "A little extra training. What do you say, tiny human? Want to practice your falling technique?" Wynn tensed, calculating distances and escape routes. The corridor was too narrow to run, and even if she could get past them, saurians were built for speed. Her best bet was probably to curl up in a ball and hope they got bored quickly. That's when the temperature in the corridor dropped about 10 degrees. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind Wynne, deep and rumbling with barely contained menace. She turned to see Malin emerging from a side passage, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. He seemed even larger in the confined space of the corridor, his massive frame filling the width from wall to wall. Drex's bravado evaporated like morning mist. "Malin," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "we were just talking." Talking? Malin's yellow eyes fixed on Drex with the kind of attention usually reserved for prey animals. "I see. And this talking requires 3 of you to surround one small human?" "It's not what it looks like," one of Drex's cronies stammered. "Good." Malin took a step forward, and all 3 saurians immediately backed away. "Because what it looks like is 3 cowards preparing to assault someone half their size, and I would be very disappointed to learn that such cowardice exists among Academy cadets." The way he said "disappointed" made it sound like a death sentence. "We weren't going to hurt her," Drex protested weakly. "Of course not." Malin's smile was all teeth and promises of violence. "Because that would require you to go through me first, and I do not think you are quite that stupid." The 3 saurians exchanged glances, seemed to reach a wordless consensus, and fled down the corridor with as much dignity as their species could muster while running away. Which wasn't much. Wynne stared after them, then turned to look up at Malin. "Way up." "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," Malin replied simply. "I did." And that's when Wynne realized her life at the Academy had just become infinitely more complicated. Word traveled fast in the Academy's gossip network, which operated with the efficiency of a military intelligence operation, and twice the accuracy of your average tabloid journalist. By dinner time, every cadet in their class knew that Malin, the walking nightmare who could probably arm wrestle a battlecruiser and win, had personally intervened to protect Wynne from Drex's idea of entertainment. The reactions were mixed. "It doesn't make sense," muttered Flux, poking at his gelatinous dinner with obvious distrust. The Aquarian's gill slits fluttered nervously as he spoke, a sure sign he was agitated. "Predator species don't protect prey species. It goes against every evolutionary instinct." "Maybe he's going soft," suggested Thix, a crystalline whose species communicated primarily through light patterns. Her current display resembled a confused disco ball. Prolonged exposure to non-predator species can sometimes cause behavioral modifications in apex hunters. Wynne stabbed her synthetic protein cube with more force than strictly necessary. "I'm sitting right here, you know. And I'm not prey." "Of course you're not, dear," said Flux, in the tone usually reserved for small children and the mentally impaired. "You're a fierce human warrior who definitely didn't get launched across the training mat like a projectile yesterday." Before Wynne could formulate a suitably cutting response, the mess hall fell silent. Not the gradual quiet of ending conversations, but the sudden, absolute silence that meant either someone very important had entered or someone very dangerous was about to do something interesting. Malin stood in the doorway, surveying the room with those predatory yellow eyes. His gaze swept across the assembled cadets before settling on Wynne's table. Without a word, he began moving toward them, his massive frame causing other students to scramble out of his path. "Oh, wonderful," Wynne muttered. "Here comes my self-appointed bodyguard." Malin reached their table and stood there for a moment, apparently considering his options. The table in question was designed for standard humanoid proportions, which meant it came up to about mid-thigh on his massive frame. Sitting down would be awkward. He solved this problem by simply grabbing an empty chair from a nearby table and positioning it at the end of Wynn's table. The chair groaned ominously under his weight, but held. Barely. "Good evening," he said politely, as if 9-foot-tall apex predators joined random dinner conversations every day. The silence stretched out like taffy. Flux's gills were practically hyperventilating. Thik's had gone completely dark, which in crystalline body language roughly translated to playing dead. The other cadets at surrounding tables were staring with the fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents and public executions. "So," Wynn said finally, because somebody had to break the silence before it became a permanent feature of the mess hall. "How's the weather?" Malin tilted his massive head. "Weather? You know, small talk. Casual conversation. The thing people do when they sit together at meals." "Ah." Malin nodded gravely. "The weather is adequate." "Riveting." "I am not familiar with this riveting," Malin said, looking genuinely puzzled. "Is this also weather-related conversation?" Despite everything, Wynn felt her lips twitch. "Never mind. What are you doing here, Malin?" "Eating," he replied, producing what appeared to be a chunk of raw meat the size of Wynn's head from somewhere on his person. "It is dinner time." "I meant, what are you doing here, at our table?" Malin considered this while tearing into his dinner with teeth that could double as industrial cutting tools. "This table has excellent sight lines to all entrances," he said between bites. "Good defensive positioning. Also, the lighting is adequate for monitoring potential threats." Flux made a sound like a deflating balloon. "Potential threats? What potential threats?" Those predatory eyes fixed on the Aquarian with uncomfortable intensity. "Unknown. This is why they are potential." The conversation, such as it was, continued in this vein for the remainder of the meal. Malin answered questions with the literal precision of someone translating everything through a universal translator, while the other cadets gradually relaxed enough to remember how to breathe properly. By the time dessert arrived, a substance that claimed to be chocolate pudding but looked suspiciously like industrial lubricant, things had almost achieved a state of normalcy. That's when Drex decided to make his entrance. The Saurian swaggered into the mess hall with his usual pack of sycophants, making enough noise to wake the dead and twice as much trouble. His eyes immediately locked onto Wynn's table, and his reptilian features twisted into an expression of malicious glee. "Well, well," he announced loudly enough for half the mess hall to hear. "Look what we have here. The tiniest cadet in the academy, dining with her pet monster." The mess hall went quiet again, but this time the silence had teeth. Malin slowly turned his head toward Drex, the movement so fluid and controlled it was somehow more menacing than any dramatic gesture could have been. "Pet monster," he repeated, his voice carrying the kind of calm that usually preceded extreme violence. Drex, apparently having misplaced whatever survival instincts evolution had given his species, decided to double down. "That's right, big guy. Everyone knows you've gone soft, following the little human around like a domesticated animal. What's next? Are you going to start doing tricks for treats?" Malin rose from his chair. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every conversation in the mess hall died. Chairs scraped as cadets turned to watch or positioned themselves for rapid evacuation. Even the serving staff stopped what they were doing, apparently sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I am going to give you one opportunity," Malin said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. to reconsider your words." Drex's bravado flickered for just a moment, but pride and stupidity are powerful motivators. Or what? You'll protect your precious little pet some more? What happened next was so fast that most of the cadets missed it entirely. One moment, Malin was standing beside the table. The next, he was directly in front of Drex, having covered the 15-foot distance in a single fluid motion that defied physics and common sense. Drex's eyes widened to roughly the size of dinner plates. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound emerged. This was probably for the best, since anything he might have said would likely have made his situation worse. Malin leaned down until his massive head was level with Drex's, those predatory features only inches from the Saurian's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the mess hall, every word carried with perfect clarity. "The small human," he said, "is under my protection. This protection extends to verbal harassment, physical intimidation, and any other behavior that might cause her distress. Do you understand?" Drex managed a barely perceptible nod. "Excellent." Malin straightened to his full height, looming over the Saurian like a mountain of scales and muscle. "I am pleased. We could reach an understanding." Drex and his cronies fled the mess hall with the kind of speed usually reserved for escaping natural disasters. The remaining cadets watched them go, then slowly turned their attention back to Malin, who was calmly returning to his seat, as if nothing unusual had happened. "That was—" Flux began, then trailed off, apparently lacking the vocabulary to properly describe what they'd just witnessed. "Unnecessary," Wynne said firmly, though her voice was slightly unsteady. "I can handle Drex myself." Malin settled back into his protesting chair and regarded her with those unsettling yellow eyes. "Can you?" "Yes." "Good," he said, resuming his meal. "It is important that you believe this." Wynne stared at him, trying to parse the meaning behind his words, but Malin had apparently decided the conversation was over. The rest of the mess hall gradually returned to normal, though she noticed several cadets stealing glances in their direction. Over the following days, a pattern began to emerge. Wherever Wynne went, Malin seemed to appear. Not obviously following her, nothing so crude as that. He simply happened to be in the same corridors, the same training facilities, the same recreational areas. Always positioned where he could observe potential threats. Always close enough to intervene if necessary. It was driving her absolutely insane. "This has to stop," she told him, after finding him lurking outside her dormitory at 0600 hours for the third consecutive morning. "What has to stop?" he asked, with the innocent expression of someone who definitely knew exactly what had to stop. "You know what? The hovering, the lurking, the spontaneous appearances whenever someone looks at me sideways." "I do not hover," Malin said with wounded dignity. "I maintain strategic positioning." "It's the same thing." "It is not. Hovering implies aimless floating behavior. My positioning is always purposeful." Wynne rubbed her temples, feeling a headache coming on. "Why are you doing this, Malin? What do you want from me?" The massive predator tilted his head, considering the question with obvious seriousness. "I want nothing from you, small human. I want things for you." "Such as?" "Safety. Respect. The opportunity to demonstrate your true capabilities without interference from those too stupid to recognize your worth." "My worth?" Wynne laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm the worst cadet in our class. I get thrown around in combat training like a child's toy. I can barely keep up with the physical requirements. What exactly do you think my worth is?" Malin was quiet for a long moment, those predatory features thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strange note of certainty. "You saved me," he said simply, "when I was in danger. When others would have hesitated or fled or sought help from authority figures, you acted without thought for your own safety. You saw what needed to be done and you did it, despite being—" He paused, apparently searching for the right words. "Small and weak?" Wynne supplied bitterly. "Different," Malin corrected. "You think in ways others do not, see solutions others miss. This is not weakness, small human. This is strength of a kind most predator species never develop." Before Wynne could respond, he was gone, moving through the corridor with that impossible fluid grace. She stood there for several minutes, staring at the spot where he'd been, trying to process what he'd said. The opportunity to test his theory came sooner than either of them expected. It was during a tactical simulation exercise, one of the few training activities where Wynne consistently performed well. The scenario involved a hostage rescue in an urban environment, with their class divided into assault teams and defensive units. Wynne found herself assigned to Assault Team 3, along with 5 other cadets who'd drawn the short straws. The defending team had barricaded themselves in a multi-story building with excellent sight lines and limited approach routes. Standard assault doctrine called for overwhelming force applied at multiple entry points simultaneously, but their team lacked the firepower for such an approach. "This is impossible," complained Vexed, a insectoid whose mandibles clicked nervously as he studied the tactical display. "They have all the advantages: high ground, defensive positions, superior numbers. We cannot win." "Sure we can," Wynne said, manipulating the holographic display to highlight several seemingly insignificant details. "We just have to change the rules." What she proposed was so unconventional it bordered on insane. Instead of a frontal assault, she suggested using the building's own infrastructure against the defenders. A series of carefully timed explosions in the basement level would compromise structural supports, forcing evacuation to lower floors, where assault teams could engage on more equal terms. "That's not how these exercises work," protested another team member. "You can't just blow up the building." "Why not?" Wynne asked. "The simulation parameters don't prohibit structural modification. They only specify that we have to rescue the hostages and neutralize the defending force." It took another 10 minutes of argument, but eventually her team agreed to try her plan. Mostly because they were facing certain defeat with conventional tactics, and unconventional defeat was at least more interesting. The results were spectacular. The defending team, caught completely off guard by the building's sudden structural instability, found their carefully prepared positions useless. As they scrambled to evacuate to lower floors, Wynne's assault teams were waiting with perfectly coordinated ambushes. The entire exercise was over in less than 20 minutes, with a complete victory for the attackers. The aftermath was equally interesting. Their instructor, a grizzled Centaurian veteran who'd seen more actual combat than the rest of the Academy faculty combined, spent 15 minutes dissecting Wynne's tactical approach. His analysis was thorough, professional, and grudgingly admiring. "Unconventional," he concluded, "but effective." Cadet Wynne demonstrated superior strategic thinking and creative problem-solving under pressure. Well done. As they filed out of the simulation chamber, Wynne became aware of something she'd never experienced before at the Academy. Her fellow cadets were looking at her with something approaching respect. Not pity, not amusement, but genuine acknowledgement that she might actually belong here. She was still processing this new development when she spotted Malin waiting in the corridor outside. The massive predator was leaning against the wall with casual grace, but those yellow eyes were fixed on her with unmistakable satisfaction. "Excellent tactical demonstration," he said as she approached. "You were watching?" "I watch all your training exercises," he said matter-of-factly. "Most are disappointing. This one was not. Thanks, I think." "You should be proud, small human. You have shown them what I already knew." "Which is?" Malthan's predatory features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. "That size and strength are not the only measures of a warrior's worth." As they walked toward the dormitory complex together, Wynne found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, Malthan was right about her potential. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Behind them, unnoticed by either cadet, Commander Uta stood in the observation booth, reviewing the tactical exercise recordings with obvious interest. The Academy's chief instructor was many things: veteran soldier, expert tactician, uncompromising disciplinarian, but she was not blind to unusual talent when she saw it. And what she'd just witnessed was definitely unusual. Commander Uta's announcement hit the Academy like a plasma torpedo through a cargo bay. The crucible, final elimination trials that would separate the wheat from the chaff, the warriors from the wannabes, the future officers from the future casualties. Only the top 50% would advance to senior training. The rest would be politely invited to explore alternative career paths, preferably ones that didn't involve getting shot at for a living. "Individual assessment only," Uta declared, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across the assembled cadets like targeting scanners. "No partnerships, no team assignments, no holding hands and singing friendship songs. You succeed alone, or you fail alone." The message was crystal clear. Malthan wouldn't be there to watch Wynne's back this time. "This is what you wanted," Malthan said later, finding her in the observation deck overlooking the Academy's main training complex. "Opportunity to prove yourself without, what did you call it? Hovering?" "Strategic positioning," Wynne corrected automatically. "And yes, this is what I wanted. Sort of. Maybe." She sighed. "Why do I feel like I'm about to throw up?" "Because you are intelligent enough to understand the stakes," Malthan replied with his usual blunt honesty. "Failure means expulsion. Expulsion means returning home to explain why you could not succeed at the one thing you wished most to do." "Thanks for the pep talk, Sunshine. Really boosting my confidence here." Malthan's massive head tilted slightly. "You do not require confidence boosting. You require truth. And the truth is that you are more capable than you believe. Even without my 9-foot-tall shadow keeping the bullies away. Especially without me." His yellow eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "I have been protective. Perhaps too protective. This has prevented you from demonstrating your full capabilities." Wynne stared at him. "Are you saying you've been holding me back?" "I am saying," Malthan said carefully, "that a warrior who never fights alone never learns to trust her own strength." The crucible began at dawn with a simple briefing. Survival scenario, hostile environment, multiple threats, both environmental and artificial. 48 hours to complete objectives and reach extraction point. Standard gear only. No special equipment. No outside assistance. No miraculous last-minute rescues from concerned apex predators. Wynne found herself assigned to Sector 9, a delightful patch of simulated wasteland featuring toxic storms, aggressive wildlife, and terrain that actively tried to kill you. Her objectives were elegantly simple: locate and secure 3 supply caches, eliminate hostile drone patrols, and survive long enough to reach the extraction zone. Malthan was assigned to Sector 2, roughly 100 kilometers away. Close enough to know she was out there somewhere, too far to help if things went sideways. The first 24 hours went better than expected. Wynn's small size proved advantageous in the rocky terrain, allowing her to take cover in spaces that would leave larger cadets exposed. Her tactical training served her well in avoiding drone patrols, and her experience with environmental hazards, gained through months of getting beaten up in various hostile conditions, kept her alive when the toxic storms hit. The problems started on day 2. She'd just secured the second supply cache when she heard the tool screaming. Human screaming, coming from somewhere to her northeast. The sound was raw, desperate, and definitely not part of the simulation. Wynn hesitated. Protocol demanded she focus on her own objectives. Helping other cadets wasn't just discouraged, it was grounds for immediate disqualification. But the screaming continued, carrying a note of genuine terror that made her stomach clench. "Damn it," she muttered, and changed course. She found the source of the commotion in a narrow canyon. 3 cadets from her class, cornered by something that definitely wasn't supposed to be in a standard survival exercise. The creature stood nearly 12 feet tall, with chitinous plates covering a body built like a nightmare's interpretation of a praying mantis. Its scythe-like arms moved with mechanical precision, herding the terrified cadets toward a dead end. One of the cadets was Flux. The Aquarian was hyperventilating so badly his gills were fluttering like broken wings. The other 2 were species she didn't recognize, but their terror was universal. The creature hadn't noticed her yet. Wynn crouched behind a boulder, mind racing through options. She had her standard combat knife, 2 smoke grenades, and whatever improvised weapons she could scavenge from the environment. Against a 12-foot killing machine, those odds were approximately terrible. But she'd learned something during her months of getting thrown around training mats. Sometimes the smallest fighter had advantages the big ones didn't expect. Wynn circled wide, using the canyon's rocky walls for cover. The creature was focused on its current prey, confident in its overwhelming superiority. Classic predator mistake. Tunnel vision on the obvious targets while ignoring peripheral threats. She positioned herself on an outcropping, about 20 feet above the creature, smoke grenades ready. The plan was insane, dangerous, and completely contrary to every survival instinct she possessed. In other words, exactly the kind of plan that might actually work. The first smoke grenade landed directly beneath the creature, filling the narrow canyon with thick, choking fog. The second one landed near the cornered cadets, giving them concealment to move. The creature spun around, confused and angry, its mechanical precision disrupted by the sudden loss of visual contact. That's when Wynn dropped on its back. What followed was less a fight than a very violent physics lesson. Wynn clung to the creature's carapace like a particularly determined parasite, jamming her combat knife into every joint and gap she could reach. The creature bucked and thrashed, trying to dislodge her, but her small size worked in her favor. Its scythe arms couldn't reach her position without risking self-injury. It took nearly 5 minutes of frantic stabbing before she found the creature's primary neural cluster. The knife slid home with a wet, final sound, and the nightmare machine collapsed in a heap of twitching chitin and sparking circuitry. Wynn rolled clear, breathing hard, and covered in various fluids she preferred not to identify. The 3 rescued cadets stared at her with expressions of awe and disbelief. "How?" Flux gasped, his gills finally returning to normal function. "How did you do that?" "Carefully," Wynn said, wiping her knife clean. "Very carefully." Later, after helping the injured cadets reach a medical evacuation point and accepting her own disqualification from the crucible, Wynne sat on a hill overlooking the extraction zone. She'd failed the exercise, but somehow it didn't feel like failure. That's where Malin found her. "I heard what happened," he said, settling beside her with surprising grace for something his size. "Yeah? What did you hear?" "That you abandoned your objectives to save 3 cadets from a malfunctioning training construct." His yellow eyes studied her profile. "That you single-handedly defeated a Class A combat unit armed only with standard gear and superior tactics. Don't forget the part where I got kicked out of the academy." "You will not be expelled," Malin said with quiet certainty. "How do you know?" "Because Commander Uta is not stupid. She understands the difference between failure and choosing a higher priority." He was quiet for a moment. "Also, because what you did today was not the action of a student. It was the action of a leader." Wynne looked at him. "A leader?" "Yes," Malin said simply. "The kind of leader worth following, worth protecting, worth serving." Something in his tone made her turn to face him fully. Those predatory features held an expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been reverence. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. Malin's smile was all teeth and ancient secrets. "That will become clear soon enough, small human. Very soon indeed." 3 days later, Wynne stood in Commander Uta's office, expecting to receive her discharge papers. Instead, she found herself facing a holographic display showing the Academy's organizational chart, with several positions she'd never seen before, highlighted in pulsing blue. "Cadet Wynne," Commander Uta began, her steel-gray eyes unreadable. "Are you familiar with the Vexmari concept of Kethmar?" "No, ma'am." "It translates roughly as battle bond or war oath," Uta explained. "Among the Vexmari, it represents the highest form of military allegiance, a predator's sworn dedication to protect and serve a chosen leader, regardless of species or physical capabilities." Wynne's stomach dropped. "Ma'am, I don't understand." "Malin," Uta called, and the massive Vexmari entered from an adjoining chamber. But something was different about his posture. More formal, more ceremonial. He wore decorations Wynne had never seen before, intricate metallic patterns that seemed to flow across his dark scales like liquid starlight. "Small human," he said, inclining his massive head in what she now recognized as a gesture of profound respect. "The time for truth has come." "What truth?" Wynne demanded, though part of her already suspected. Malin's yellow eyes held hers steadily. "I am not merely a cadet. I am Malin Kethvar, 3rd Talon of the Vexmari Royal Guard, heir to the obsidian throne of my people. I came to this academy not to learn warfare. My species perfected that art before yours discovered fire. I came to find something far more precious." "Which is?" "A leader worthy of absolute loyalty," Commander Uta interjected. "The Alliance faces threats that require new thinking, unconventional solutions. The old ways, overwhelming force, traditional tactics, are no longer sufficient. We need officers who can see beyond conventional limitations." Wynne felt the world tilting around her. "You're talking about me." "Your performance in the crucible confirmed what Malin suspected from the beginning," Uta continued. "You don't fight like a human, Wynne. You fight like something entirely new. When faced with impossible odds, you don't retreat or request backup. You find the one solution no one else would consider." "The carnivorous plant," Wynne said slowly. "The building collapse, the combat drone. Each time you ignored conventional wisdom and found the weak point others missed," Malin said. "This is not human tactical thinking. This is something evolution has never produced before. a strategic mind unbound by predator or prey instincts. What are you asking me to do? Commander Uta stepped forward. Command a new unit. Multi-species, unconventional warfare specialists. Malin has already sworn Cathmar to you, the first time in Vexmari history that royalty has pledged allegiance to another species. Wynne looked at Malthan's imposing form, understanding finally dawning. You've been testing me this whole time. Protecting you, he corrected, until you were ready to protect others. His predatory features softened into something approaching warmth. I knew from the moment you dropped from that tree to save me, a creature that could tear you apart without effort, that I had found what I sought. And if I refuse, then I will follow you anyway. Malin said simply. Cathmar is not conditional, small human. You are my chosen leader, whether you lead one Vexmari or entire armies. Wynne looked between them, feeling the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like armor. Outside the office windows, she could see her fellow cadets going through their training exercises, preparing for conventional careers in conventional military roles. She thought of Flux's terrified gills, of impossible odds overcome through lateral thinking, of a 9-foot apex predator who saw strength where others saw weakness. When do we start? She asked. Malthan's smile was radiant and terrible. We already have, my commander. We already have.